A millionaire callously tossed a handful of crisp bills onto the floor, his voice dripping with mockery. "Take this and buy yourself better clothes, you reek of poverty." But what she said next left everyone in stunned silence. Mason Donovan adjusted the cuff of his impeccably tailored suit as he strode into the grand dining hall of La Belle Époque, his crown jewel, the most prestigious restaurant in New York City. The chandeliers bathed the elite guests in a golden glow, the soft chime of crystal glasses harmonizing with the subdued notes of classical music. This was his domain, a world sculpted from power, wealth, and unchallenged authority. "Mr. Donovan," a waiter greeted him with a nervous bow, "your table is prepared." Mason barely acknowledged the man as he moved with effortless confidence toward the most coveted seat in the house. Every pair of eyes followed his passage, some with admiration, others with thinly veiled apprehension. He had built his empire from the ground up, transforming a single restaurant into a national luxury brand. Now, no one dared to question him, except for incompetence, which he had no tolerance for. The evening was meant to be seamless, a gathering of investors, top-tier executives, and socialites, the kind of people who mattered. But his mood darkened the moment he noticed his wine glass was empty. He lifted a single finger, expecting swift service. Waiters glided like shadows across the room, yet none reached him fast enough. His irritation simmered beneath a carefully controlled expression. At last, a young waitress approached, but too slowly for his liking. Her uniform was crisp but modest, and unlike the polished, insincere smiles of the other staff, hers remained neutral, almost indifferent. "Sir, what can I get you?" Mason didn't bother glancing at the menu. "A Chateau Margaux, and be quick about it." "Of course," she replied evenly. Something in her tone irked him. It wasn't disrespectful, but it lacked the usual deference he was accustomed to. Minutes crawled by. Mason's patience wore thin as his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm against the pristine tablecloth. Across from him, an investor let out a low chuckle. "Trouble getting decent service in your own establishment, Donovan?" A few others exchanged amused glances. Mason's jaw tightened. When the waitress finally returned, placing the wine before him, he barely gave her the chance to set it down before speaking, his tone edged with disdain. "Tell me, is this your usual pace, or is tonight a special display of incompetence?" The room hushed. A few executives shared knowing smirks, savoring the unfolding spectacle. They had seen Mason publicly humiliate employees before. It was almost a form of entertainment. Yet, the waitress remained unfazed. She met his gaze without the slightest flicker of shame or apology. "I brought your wine, sir." It was the way she said it, calm, unwavering, that ignited something sharp in him. His smirk turned cruel. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and with calculated malice, let them slip through his fingers, fluttering to the floor. "Take this," Mason said, his voice laced with condescension. "Buy yourself a better uniform, you reek of poverty." A ripple of laughter swept through the room. Some guests stifled their amusement behind delicate sips of wine, while others exchanged knowing glances, anticipating the inevitable. A flustered apology, a desperate scramble for the bills scattered on the floor. But she did neither. Instead, the young woman simply glanced down at the money before lifting her gaze back to Mason. Her expression remained unreadable, an unsettling calm settling over her features. And then, with a voice steady as stone, she delivered the words that sent an icy hush through the room. "I don't need your money," she said. Then, without breaking eye contact, she added, "In fact, by tomorrow morning, I'll be buying this company." Silence. Then, laughter. It started as a low chuckle from one of the investors, then grew, rolling through the room like a wave. Amused murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's rich," someone muttered, swirling their drink. Mason smirked, shaking his head. "You? Buy my company?" The young woman merely picked up the empty tray from the table. "Enjoy your wine, Mr. Donovan." And with that, she turned and walked away. Mason dismissed it without a second thought. To him, it was nothing more than an empty boast, a last-ditch attempt at dignity from someone who had no real understanding of how power worked. The evening continued without further incident. And yet, long after the final toast had been raised and the last guest had departed, her words lingered, faint whispers in the back of his mind. The morning after. Mason was jolted awake by the persistent buzzing of his phone. Groggy, he reached for it, squinting at the screen. Dozens of missed calls. His executive team? His brow furrowed as unease coiled in his chest. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he unlocked his phone and scanned his emails. Then, he froze. A message from his CFO, urgent and brief. "Call me. It's an emergency. The company has been sold." For a moment, his mind refused to process the words. Sold? Impossible. He owned the majority shares. No one could have bought him out overnight. The phone buzzed again. His assistant. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with panic, "you need to get to the office immediately. There's been a..." Before she could finish, another email appeared in his inbox. Official press release. Westwood Holdings acquires Donovan Enterprises. A chill snaked down his spine. His fingers tightened around the phone as he scrolled through the statement, his pulse hammering. Effective immediately, all Donovan Enterprises assets have been transferred to new ownership under Avery Westwood. The name struck him like a fist to the gut. No, this couldn't be real. His mind snapped back to the night before. The waitress, her voice echoed in his head. "By tomorrow morning, I'll be buying this company." Mason bolted out of bed, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, something unfamiliar coursed through him. Fear. The takeover. Mason stormed into the headquarters of Donovan Enterprises, his pulse thundering in his ears. The words from the press release looped in his mind, a nightmare playing on repeat. Westwood Holdings acquires Donovan Enterprises. It had to be a mistake, a sick joke. As he shoved past the reception desk, he caught whispers, hushed voices, furtive glances from employees who once shrank under his presence. But today, they weren't afraid. They were watching him, assessing him. By the time he reached the executive boardroom, his senior team was already gathered, the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate. No one met his gaze. Richard Lane, his CFO, was the first to rise as Mason entered. His expression was grim. "Mason?" Richard began cautiously. Bang. Mason's fist slammed against the glass wall. "What the hell is going on?" No one spoke. Richard exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. "As of this morning, Donovan Enterprises no longer belongs to you." His voice was controlled, but there was something else beneath it. Finality. The majority shares were acquired overnight by Westwood Holdings. The deal was finalized before the markets opened. The room spun. Mason staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair. His entire empire, years of dominance, of absolute control, had been stripped away in a matter of hours. And the person who had done it? The waitress? Avery Westwood. The realization slammed into him like a freight train. For the first time in his life, Mason Donovan wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was the one being played. Mason's hands curled into fists. His pulse pounded in his ears. "That's impossible. I control the board. I own the majority." "You did," Richard interrupted, his voice even but firm. "But the moment you leveraged company stock as collateral for your expansion last year, you left yourself exposed." They waited for the perfect moment to strike. Mason's jaw locked. The memory hit like a slap. The loans. The calculated risk. The temporary release of certain shares. It was supposed to be controlled, a stepping stone, not a downfall. But now it was gone. Richard exhaled, watching the realization sink in. They played you, Mason. And they played you brilliantly. A slow, creeping chill slithered down Mason's spine. "Who's behind this?" Richard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Then you already know the answer." Mason's stomach clenched. The truth struck before Richard could say it aloud. Avery Westwood. The name felt foreign in his mouth, unfamiliar. And yet, it shouldn't have. He should have recognized it the moment she spoke last night. He should have seen it in the way she didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't scramble for the money he tossed at her feet. Because she didn't need it. Because she had been waiting for this moment. Mason inhaled sharply, his mind spinning. "Where is she?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Already in your office." A pause, then the correction. "Her office, now." Mason didn't hesitate. He tore out of the conference room, his pace unrelenting as he stormed through the hallways, ignoring the stares, the whispers. He reached his office, the empire he built, the throne he ruled from, and shoved the doors open with a forceful bang. Inside, seated behind his desk, her desk, was Avery Westwood. She didn't look uncomfortable, she didn't look overwhelmed, she looked exactly where she belonged. Her lips curved into the barest hint of a smirk. "Mr. Donovan, how nice of you to drop by." Mason's fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Avery leaned back in the chair, utterly unfazed by his rage. "I would think that's obvious. I'm taking back what belongs to my family." Mason let out a sharp, derisive scoff. "Your family? You're just a spoiled little girl playing dress-up in the real world." Her eyes gleamed. "Interesting perspective. Tell me, does it feel real enough now?" Mason took a step forward, voice low, dangerous. "Undo this." Avery chuckled, soft and almost amused. "You really don't get it, do you?" She stood, walking around the desk slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "This was never truly your company. It was built on a betrayal. My father was your partner once, until you stabbed him in the back and took everything for yourself." Mason's expression darkened. "Your father was weak. He didn't have the stomach for business." Avery tilted her head, the ghost of a smile on her lips. "And yet, here I am, standing in your office, holding your company in my hands. Funny how things turn out." A hot wave of fury surged through him. "I built this empire. You think you can just walk in here and take it from me?" She folded her arms. "I don't think I can. I did." His teeth clenched so hard it hurt. "This isn't over. I'll find a way to take it back." Avery's smirk remained. "Oh, I know you'll try. That's why I've prepared something special for you." Mason's eyes narrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" She reached for a sleek folder on the desk, sliding it across to him. "This," she said smoothly, "is your new contract, Mason." His jaw tensed as he snatched it up, flipping through the pages. The more he read, the tighter his grip became. The deeper the sinking feeling in his gut grew. This wasn't just a takeover. It was checkmate. "This is a joke," Mason hissed, his grip tightening on the contract. Avery shook her head, her expression unreadable. "Not at all. You see, I could have thrown you out today, humiliated you the way you tried to humiliate me, but instead, I've decided to offer you a job." His eyes narrowed. "A consultant?" Avery let out a soft, almost amused laugh. "Oh no, that would be far too generous. I'm offering you something much better. A chance to understand what real work looks like." Mason froze as she stepped closer, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "The only position available for you now is as a server in the very restaurant where you threw money at my feet," she said, her voice steady. "And you will take it, or you'll walk out of here with nothing." His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just a loss, this was personal. Avery leaned in slightly, her voice just above a whisper. "So, what will it be, Mr. Donovan?" The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. He had no power, no leverage. His own arrogance had led him here, and for the first time in his life he had no choice but to obey. The fall. Mason sat in his penthouse, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. But he wasn't looking at the city. He was staring at the contract in his hands, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. Avery Westwood owned him now. His company, his empire, it was gone, and the only way to remain involved, even in the smallest capacity, was to accept a job as a waiter. Disgust churned in his stomach. He had spent years clawing his way to the top, crushing anyone who stood in his way, ensuring no one ever had the power to look down on him. And now, he was being forced into the very role he had spent his entire career belittling. His phone buzzed. Richard Lane Mason ignored the call. He already knew what Richard would say. Take the deal, swallow your pride, wait for an opening. But Mason didn't want to wait. He wanted revenge. Now he downed a glass of whiskey, the burn barely registering as his mind raced back to Avery. She had played him flawlessly, waiting for the precise moment to rip everything from his grasp. And yet, there had been something in her eyes, something that went beyond business. This wasn't just about winning, it was about him, and Mason needed to know why. The first day as a waiter? The next evening, Mason stepped into La Belle Époque no longer as its powerful CEO, but as a lowly employee. The shift in the air was immediate. Employees who once trembled at his presence now whispered behind their hands. Some smirked, others watched with barely concealed amusement. And then, there were those who looked right through him with indifference. As if he no longer mattered. His stomach twisted, but he squared his shoulders. If she thinks she can break me, she's dead wrong. Marina Ramirez, a veteran waitress in her 40s, crossed her arms as she looked him over. "Never thought I'd see the day," she muttered. Leo Morgan, the head chef, leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms folded. "I'd give him a week," he said, smirking. "Maybe 2, if he doesn't cry first." Mason ignored them both. Instead, his eyes locked onto Avery. She was already watching him from across the restaurant, and this time she wasn't smirking. As she approached, her gaze was steady, unreadable. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, stopping in front of him. "You're not special anymore. No one here cares about your last name, your bank account, or the fact that you used to own this place." Her words cut deeper than he expected, but Mason didn't flinch. "Not yet, because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot." Mason's jaw tightened. "And yet, you went through all this trouble just to put me here." A flicker of something, anger, amusement, or maybe something far more complicated passed across Avery's face before she spoke again. "You're going to learn how the world really works, Mason, and if you quit, you walk away with nothing." Mason's fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't about to let her win. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's get this over with." Avery barely reacted. She simply nodded toward Marina. "She'll train you." Marina let out a long, suffering sigh, shaking her head. "God help me." A taste of humility. Within an hour, Mason realized something horrifying. Waiting tables was actually hard. It wasn't just carrying plates and jotting down orders. It was a relentless, fast-pacing grind that demanded patience, attentiveness, and coordination, none of which he had ever needed before. By the second hour, he had spilled wine on a customer, mixed up orders, and nearly sent an entire tray of food crashing to the ground. By the third, his feet throbbed, his once crisp shirt was stained, and the kitchen staff was openly laughing at him. And the customers? They treated him exactly the way he used to treat his employees. One woman snapped her fingers at him impatiently. A businessman barely acknowledged his presence, waving him off like an inconvenience. Another guest mocked his slow service under their breath. And then came the worst of it. A pair of wealthy investors, people he once did business with, recognized him. They didn't hide their amusement, they laughed, out loud. It was humiliating, but worst of all, Avery saw every second of it. She stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching his struggle. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't gloating, she was simply observing. And somehow, that infuriated him more than anything else. The breaking point. Near the end of his shift, Mason slumped against the kitchen counter, exhaustion and frustration warring inside him. Leo strolled in, shaking his head. "You look like hell, Donovan." Mason ignored him. Leo chuckled. "Let me guess, you thought this would be easy?" Mason's patience snapped. He turned abruptly, slamming his tray down onto the counter. "I built this place, I ran this empire, and now I'm supposed to what? Serve food like a damn servant?" Leo didn't flinch. He simply shrugged. "Welcome to reality, rich boy." Mason's teeth clenched so hard it hurt. "Screw this. I don't need this job." Without another word, he stormed out of the kitchen, heading straight for the exit. But just as he reached the front door, Avery's voice stopped him. "Walking away already?" Mason froze. Slowly, he turned. Avery stood a few feet away, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. "That's it?" she said. "You lasted one shift?" Mason didn't reply. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but cutting. "I expected more from you, Donovan. I thought you had fight in you." Something inside Mason twisted. He knew what she was doing. She was pushing him, testing him, waiting to see how far he'd go before he broke, and he hated that it was working. His pride screamed at him to walk out and never look back, but something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name, made him hesitate. Because for the first time in years, Mason Donovan had something to prove, and not to her, to himself. Gritting his teeth, Mason turned away from the exit. "I'll see you tomorrow, boss," he muttered before disappearing into the back, and for the first time that night, Avery smiled. thrown to the wolves. Mason Donovan never thought he'd find himself back here. Yet here he was, standing in the bustling kitchen of La Belle Poke, dressed in a waiter's uniform, gripping a notepad, bracing himself for another night of humiliation. The previous evening had been a disaster. He had fumbled orders, spilled drinks, and endured the mockery of both customers and staff. He had wanted to walk away, nearly had, but something about Avery's words had stuck with him. "I thought you had fight in you." She was testing him, daring him to fail. And Mason never failed. That was why he had come back. Not because he cared about the job, not because he accepted this as his new reality, but because he refused to let her win. The restaurant was already packed. High-profile clientele, VIP guests, the elite. The kind of people Mason used to dine with, not serve. "Here," Marina said, shoving a tray into his hands stacked with 3 full plates. "Table 7. Mason barely had time to adjust before she was already moving on. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. Balance, posture, confidence. He could do this. Then, his stomach twisted. At table 7, swirling a glass of expensive wine, was James Caldwell, a longtime rival. A man who had been waiting, practically hoping for Mason to fall. The moment Caldwell saw him, his lips curled into a slow, delighted smirk. "Well, well," Caldwell mused, setting his glass down. "I heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. Mason Donovan, reduced to a server? My night just got a whole lot more interesting." The other guests chuckled, sipping their drinks, watching like spectators at a gladiator match. Mason felt his grip tighten on the tray, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Your meal, sir," he said, carefully placing the plates down with steady hands. Caldwell watched him with mock amusement. "You know," he mused, "I always thought you were too arrogant for your own good. Guess someone finally put you in your place." Mason bit his tongue, swallowed his pride. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice perfectly controlled. Caldwell's grin widened. "Actually, yes, you missed a spot." He motioned to an imaginary stain on the tablecloth. "Be a good waiter and wipe it down, will you?" Laughter erupted around the table. Mason's blood boiled, but he refused to give Caldwell the satisfaction of a reaction. With deliberate slowness, he grabbed the cloth from his pocket and wiped the non-existent stain. His movements were slow, precise, controlled. Caldwell chuckled. "Good boy." Mason straightened, gave a tight-lipped smile, and walked away without another word. The moment he stepped into the kitchen, he slammed the tray onto the counter. "Easy there, champ," Leo taunted from across the room. "Wouldn't want you to break something again." Mason exhaled sharply. Steady. Stay in control. He could do this. He had to. A lesson in control. An hour passed. Then another. Mason was getting better, but the customers were relentless. He was ignored, insulted, treated like he didn't exist. And the worst part? Avery saw everything. She stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, her gaze steady. She wasn't mocking him, but she wasn't helping him either, and that infuriated him. During a rare lull, he finally walked up to her. "You enjoying this?" he asked, voice low. Avery raised a brow. "Enjoying what?" Mason scoffed. "Watching me struggle." She tilted her head slightly. "You think this is about me watching you suffer?" He folded his arms. "Isn't it?" Avery studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said softly. Mason frowned. "This isn't about revenge, Mason," she continued. "This is about perspective." She stepped closer. "You used to be the guy in the suit, barking orders, treating people like they were beneath you. Now? You're the one on the other side of the table." Mason said nothing. Avery's voice remained even, controlled. "Do you know how many times I saw employees walk out of here in tears because of how you treated them?" She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Her words alone were enough. "Do you know how many people lost their jobs because they couldn't meet your impossible standards?" Mason looked away. "I don't need to humiliate you, Mason," she said quietly. "You're doing that all on your own." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, her words sinking deep. The tipping point. Near the end of the night, Mason was clearing a table when he heard the sharp clatter of glass. A woman in an expensive dress had knocked over her wine. The deep red liquid splashed onto her designer purse. "Oh my God," she gasped, eyes widening in horror. Then, just as quickly, her shock turned to anger. She turned to Mason, her voice sharp. "Look what you did." Mason blinked. "Ma'am, that wasn't me." "Ah?" she snapped. "This purse is worth more than your entire life." The restaurant hushed. Eyes turned staff, customers. Avery Shee stood near the bar, watching intently. Mason clenched his jaw. This was it, the moment that separated who he used to be from who he was becoming. He could react like the old Mason, arrogant, aggressive, defensive, or he could prove something. He took a slow, measured breath. "I apologize, ma'am. Let me clean that for you." The woman scoffed. "Just get me a manager." A low, mocking laugh sounded from behind. Caldwell mused. "Wow," Caldwell mused, swirling his drink lazily. The great Mason Donovan, apologizing like a common worker. "I have to say, I love this new look on you." A few customers chuckled. Mason could feel Avery's eyes on him. He had a choice. He could storm off, lose control, give them exactly what they wanted. Or, he smiled. "Of course, sir," he said smoothly, keeping his voice even. "Would you like another drink while you watch?" Caldwell's smirk faltered. The laughter at the table shifted. Customers exchanged glances. Some chuckled, not at Mason, but at Caldwell. For the first time all night, Mason felt in control. And Avery saw it too. She turned away, but not before he caught the small smile playing on her lips. Just maybe, he was starting to understand. Back to square one. Mason Donovan never thought he'd find himself back here. Yet here he was, standing in the kitchen of La Belle Poke, dressed in a waiter's uniform, gripping a notepad, preparing for another night of humiliation. The previous evening had been a disaster. He had fumbled orders, spilled drinks, endured the mockery of both customers and staff. He had wanted to walk away, nearly had, but something about Avery's words had stuck with him. "I thought you had fight in you." She was testing him, daring him to fail. And Mason never failed. That was why he had come back, not because he cared about the job, not because he accepted this as his reality, but because he refused to let her win. Thrown to the wolves. The restaurant was already alive with energy. High-profile clientele, VIP guests, the kind of people Mason used to dine with, not serve. "Here," Marina said, handing him a tray stacked with 3 full plates, table 7. Mason barely had time to adjust before she was already moving on. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. Balance, posture, confidence. He could do this. Then, as he approached the table, his stomach twisted. Seated at the elegantly set table, swirling a glass of expensive wine, was James Caldwell. A longtime rival in the business world, a man who had spent years waiting for an opportunity to revel in Mason's downfall. The moment Caldwell's gaze landed on him, a slow, delighted smirk stretched across his lips. "Well, well," he mused, setting his glass down with deliberate ease. "I heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. Mason Donovan, reduced to a server. My night just got a whole lot more interesting." The guests at his table exchanged amused glances, stifling laughter behind their drinks. Mason felt his grip tighten on the tray, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Your meal, sir," he said evenly, carefully setting the plates down in front of them. Caldwell studied him with feigned amusement. "You know, I always thought you were too arrogant for your own good. Guess someone finally put you in your place." Mason swallowed the sharp retort burning at the back of his throat. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice steady, carefully controlled. Caldwell's smirk widened. "Actually, yes, you missed a spot." He gestured lazily toward the pristine tablecloth. "Be a good waiter and wipe it down, will you?" Laughter erupted around the table, their enjoyment at his expense as blatant as the condescension dripping from Caldwell's voice. Mason's blood boiled, but he refused to take the bait. He would not give Caldwell the satisfaction of a reaction. Keeping his expression unreadable, he pulled a cloth from his pocket and wiped the non-existent stain, his movements slow, deliberate, precise. Caldwell chuckled. "Good boy." Mason straightened, locking eyes with him for the briefest moment before offering a tight-lipped, hollow smile. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. The moment he stepped into the kitchen, he slammed the tray onto the counter. "Easy there, champ," Leo taunted from across the room, leaning against the doorway with a smirk. Wouldn't want you to break something again. Mason exhaled sharply, shoving down the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He could do this. He had to. A lesson in control. An hour passed, then another. Mason was improving. His steps were steadier, his hands surer, his mistakes fewer. But the customers were relentless. He was insulted, dismissed, treated like he was invisible, and the worst part, Avery saw everything. She stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, watching in silence. She wasn't smirking, she wasn't mocking him, but she wasn't helping him either, and somehow, that infuriated him more than anything else. A shift in perspective. During a rare lull in the evening, Mason finally walked up to Avery. His voice was low, edged with frustration. "You enjoying this?" Avery arched a brow. "Enjoying what?" Mason scoffed. "Watching me struggle." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You think this is about me watching you suffer?" He folded his arms, jaw tight. "Isn't it?" Avery held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You still don't get it, do you?" Mason frowned. "This isn't about revenge, Mason," she continued. "This is about perspective. You used to be the one in the suit, barking orders, treating people like they were beneath you. Now, you're the one on the other side of the table." Mason said nothing. She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Do you know how many times I saw employees walk out of here in tears because of how you treated them?" Her voice wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. It was calm, controlled. "Do you know how many people lost their jobs because they couldn't meet your impossible standards?" Mason's gaze dropped slightly. "I don't need to humiliate you," Avery said, her tone unwavering. "You're doing that all on your own." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. And for the first time, Mason wasn't angry. He was thinking. The tipping point. Near the end of the night, Mason was clearing a table when a sharp gasp cut through the low hum of the restaurant. A woman in an expensive dress had knocked over her wine glass, deep red liquid splashing onto her designer purse. "Oh my God!" she gasped, eyes wide with horror. Then, just as quickly, her shock turned into fury. She turned to Mason, voice sharp and accusatory. "Look what you did!" Mason blinked, taken aback. "Ma'am, that wasn't me." "Don't argue," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "This purse is worth more than your entire life." The air in the restaurant shifted. Heads turned. Customers, staff. And standing near the bar, watching intently, Avery. Mason clenched his jaw. This was it. The moment that would define who he was becoming. He could react like the old Mason, arrogant, defensive, the man who refused to be disrespected, or he could prove something. He took a slow, measured breath. "I apologize, ma'am. Let me clean that for you." The woman scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Just get me a manager." A quiet laugh came from behind Caldwell. Mason turned, just in time to see his old rival smirking. "Wow," Caldwell mused, voice dripping with amusement. "The great Mason Donovan, apologizing like a common worker. I have to say, I love this new look on you." A few customers chuckled. Mason could feel Avery's eyes on him. He had a choice. He could storm off, lose control, prove everyone right. Or, he smiled. "Of course, sir," he said smoothly, voice even. "Would you like another drink while you watch?" Caldwell's smirk faltered. The customers exchanged glances. A few chuckled, not at Mason but at Caldwell. For the first time all night, Mason felt in control. A different feeling. Mason stood outside the restaurant, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his breath visible in the crisp night air. Tonight had been another brutal reminder of his downfall, but something about the way it ended, about the way he had handled himself, felt different. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it wasn't complete humiliation either. For the first time since losing everything, he had controlled the situation, instead of letting it control him. And Avery had seen it. She had watched him closely all night, waiting for him to break. But he hadn't. Not completely. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he turned back toward the building. He wasn't leaving yet. Not until he got answers. The truth. Mason pushed open the door to the now empty restaurant. Most of the staff had already left, except for Avery. She stood near the bar, flipping through a stack of papers, her focus unwavering. She didn't look up when he approached. "You got a second?" he asked, his voice steady. Avery glanced at the clock on the wall before finally meeting his gaze. "It's late." Mason ignored the dismissal. "Why are you really doing this?" Avery exhaled, setting the papers down. "We've been over this." "No," he countered. "You've given me the speech, the whole 'you deserve this' routine, but that's not the full story, is it?" For the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression. Hesitation, maybe even guilt, but it vanished just as quickly. "You took everything from me, Avery." His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Fine. I get it, you wanted justice for your father, but this?" He gestured around the empty restaurant. "This is personal. You could have kicked me out, ruined my reputation, and walked away, but instead you made me a waiter in my own empire. That's not just about business. That's something else." Avery's posture stiffened. "You don't get to act like a victim, Mason." His temper flared. "I'm not. I just want to know the truth." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "You humiliated my father." Her voice was even, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. "You didn't just take the company from him, you destroyed him. You turned him into a joke." Mason's jaw tightened. You knew Landon Westwood had taken the loss hard. But he hadn't thought about the aftermath. He hadn't cared. Avery's gaze didn't waver. "My father wasn't a weak man, but you made sure the world saw him as one." He went from being a respected businessman to someone who couldn't walk into a room without people whispering behind his back. Mason clenched his fists. He had always framed it as just business, a necessary move, a game he had won. But to her, to her father, it had never been just business. Avery's voice softened, just slightly. He spent years trying to rebuild himself, trying to move on, and when he finally did, when he finally started something new, a moment of truth. Avery's gaze was unwavering. "You crushed that too." Mason frowned. "That wasn't personal, that was business." She let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Right, business. Just like tonight, when James Caldwell treated you like garbage. That was just business, right?" His fists clenched instinctively. "You don't like being treated like you don't matter, do you?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. "Imagine living like that for years. That's what you did to him." Mason didn't look away, but something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about winning. He had taken everything from Landon Westwood and never looked back. "You wanted to hurt me," he said quietly. "The way I hurt him." Avery didn't deny it. "And is it working?" For the first time, she hesitated. She should have said yes. She should have smirked. She should have told him this was exactly what he deserved, but instead, she looked uncertain, and that told him more than words ever could. "I don't know yet," she admitted finally. Mason exhaled. He hadn't expected honesty. He had expected smug satisfaction, triumph, maybe even anger. But this was something else. "So what happens now?" he asked. Avery shrugged. "That's up to you. You can keep playing the arrogant CEO who lost everything and pretend this is all beneath you, or you can start figuring out what you want to do next." He studied her for a long moment. "And if I quit?" Her expression hardened. "Then you walk away with nothing." Mason already knew that what he didn't know was whether walking away was still his best move. For years, he had built himself into a man who never looked back. He made calculated choices, never let emotion interfere with his success. But tonight, for the first time, he felt something different. He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just humiliated. He was curious, not just about Avery's motives, but about his own reaction to all of this. "You think I can change?" he asked suddenly. Avery blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I think people only change when they want to." "Do you?" She hesitated. "I guess we'll find out, won't we?" He nodded slowly. Maybe he would. Maybe this was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Or maybe it was just the beginning. Mason took a step back. "I'll see you tomorrow." Then he turned and walked away, before she could say anything else. And for the first time since losing everything, he didn't feel like he was running. The morning after, Mason had never dreaded going to work before. For years, stepping into his restaurants had been a power move, a reminder to everyone that he was untouchable, that he ruled over them all. Now, every step toward La Belle Poke felt like a slow walk to the gallows. The morning after his confrontation with Avery, he stood outside the restaurant for a solid minute before finally pushing open the doors. The air inside was thick with the usual morning rush. Staff preparing for another high-end evening, waiters polishing glasses, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. And the moment they saw him, the whispers began. Can you believe he actually came back? Bet you he won't last the week, a test of endurance. I give him 2 more shifts before he cracks. Mason clenched his jaw but kept his expression neutral as he walked to the back to grab his apron. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The old Mason would have fired every single one of them for even thinking of mocking him. The new Mason, well, the new Mason didn't exist yet. He was just a man who had lost everything and had no idea what the hell he was supposed to do next. "Morning, rich boy," Leo greeted him from the kitchen doorway, biting into an apple. "You sleep okay after your public humiliation last night?" Mason didn't take the bait. You're still talking? That's disappointing." Leo chuckled. "Look at you, learning self-control, baby steps, I guess." Mason ignored him and headed toward the staff area to start his shift. Avery was already there, speaking with Marina. She didn't acknowledge him immediately, but when she finally did, she studied him for a second before nodding. "Glad to see you came back." Mason shrugged. "Wouldn't want to make it too easy for you." Marina snorted. "Let's see if you actually survived the lunch rush first, hotshot." The lunch rush. It turned out, lunch rushes were hell. Mason had thought dinner service was bad, but at least dinner had some rhythm. Lunch was pure chaos, orders flying in every second, customers demanding immediate attention, trays being shuffled so fast that he nearly lost his footing more than once. By the time he reached his third table, he was already sweating, gripping his notepad so tightly that his knuckles ached. A middle-aged woman, draped in too much jewelry, barely glanced at him as she snapped, "I've been waiting for my drink for 10 minutes. Do you think I have all day?" Mason gritted his teeth, forcing himself to nod. "Right away, ma'am." As he turned toward the bar, Marina smirked. "Look at you, not snapping at a customer. I'm so proud." "Shut up," Mason muttered, grabbing the drink and making his way back. The woman barely acknowledged it, waving him off. Finally, Mason exhaled slowly and moved on. This was torture. This was beneath him, and yet, somewhere deep inside, something nagged at him. Because for the first time in his life, he was seeing things from the other side, a hard truth. By the end of the shift, his feet ached, his shirt was damp, and he felt like collapsing. Leaning against the back counter, he ran a hand through his hair as Avery approached. "Survived another day," she observed. "Barely." "You'll get better." Mason let out a dry laugh. "And here I thought you'd be rooting for me to fail." Avery tilted her head. "If I wanted you to fail, I wouldn't have given you a job. I want you to learn, Mason. That's the whole point." He didn't respond right away, because for the first time, he realized that maybe she was serious. Maybe this wasn't just about revenge. Maybe, just maybe, she actually wanted him to understand something. He scoffed, shaking his head. "You think waiting tables is going to change me?" Avery crossed her arms. "I think it's a start. You spent years acting like money made you untouchable. But you're touching reality now, aren't you?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Spare me the moral lesson." She studied him. "You still think this is just punishment. It's not." He frowned. "Then what the hell is it?" "It's perspective," she said simply. "You spent your whole life at the top. You never once looked down and thought about the people carrying you. Now, you don't have a choice but to see them." Mason hated that her words struck something inside him. Because the truth was, she wasn't wrong. He had never cared about the people who worked under him, not really. They were tools, a means to an end. If one failed, another took their place. Now, he was the one being treated like he didn't matter, and it sucked. He rubbed his face, exhausted. "Look, I came back, didn't I? Doesn't that count for something?" Avery tilted her head. "It counts for effort. That's it." Then, with a knowing smile, she added, That's more than you've ever given before." Mason didn't have a response to that, because she was right. A reluctant effort. For the first time in years, Mason was putting effort into something he didn't control, and he hated how much it unsettled him. "See you tomorrow?" Avery asked. Mason straightened. His body ached. His ego was bruised. His pride was in shambles. But for some reason, the words came easily. "Yeah," he said. "See you tomorrow." Avery watched him as he walked out, something unreadable in her eyes. And for the first time since losing everything, Mason felt like maybe he wasn't completely lost after all. The shift in the air. Mason had barely set foot in La Belle Poke when he felt a shift. The staff weren't just whispering anymore. They were watching, judging, waiting. It had been a week since he started working as a waiter, and while the initial shock of seeing their former boss in a uniform had worn off, there was still an undeniable tension every time he stepped onto the floor. No one had forgotten who he used to be. No one had forgiven him either. And tonight, he was about to learn just how deep those wounds ran. The dinner rush was already in full swing. The restaurant was packed with New York's elite, people Mason once considered equals. Now, they barely acknowledged him. He carried a tray of expensive entrees toward table 5, carefully balancing the plates, when a voice stopped him in his tracks. Unbelievable, a familiar voice. Mason's stomach twisted. Seated at the table, swirling his drink with a slow, amused smirk, was Landon Hale, a corporate executive, a man who, up until a few months ago, had desperately tried to do business with him. Now, Landon was staring at him with something bordering on glee, his date barely concealing her delight. "Mason Donovan," Landon said, shaking his head. "Serving food now? I've seen everything." Mason's grip on the tray tightened. "Your steaks," he said flatly, setting the plate down. Landon ignored the food, his eyes gleaming with mockery. "Tell me, Donovan, how does it feel, knowing you used to own this place, and now you're, what, cleaning up after people like me?" His date giggled, sipping her wine. Mason forced his expression to remain blank. "Enjoy your meal." He turned to leave, but Landon wasn't finished. "Hold on." His voice dripped with fake politeness. Mason stopped. I think I need another drink." He let the words hang, waiting for the moment they would land exactly as he intended. Mason didn't react. Landon smirked. "Be a good waiter and get me another scotch. Neat." The way he said it, like an order, like Mason was nothing but background noise, made something snap inside him. For years, Mason had been the one giving orders. For years, he had treated people like they were nothing. Now, he was the one being told his place, the test now. He was the background noise, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel Avery's gaze from across the room. She was watching, waiting, testing him. If he walked away now, he'd prove that he was still the same man he had always been, arrogant, petty, unwilling to face the consequences of his past. But if he stayed, Mason exhaled slowly. "Right away, sir," he said, his voice even. He turned, walking toward the bar, forcing himself to breathe. He wasn't doing this for Landon. He was doing this because if he wanted to prove something, to Avery, to himself, that he wasn't just some entitled businessman who couldn't handle real life. He had to face moments like this head-on, even if it killed him inside. A bitter truth. Leo was already smirking when Mason reached the bar. "That was fun to watch," the chef commented. "You looked like you were about to throw a punch." Mason ignored him, focusing on pouring the drink. "Seriously," Leo continued, "Landon's an ass, but you kind of deserve it, don't you think?" Mason's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap, because deep down, Leo was right. For years, Mason had treated people like disposable chess pieces, never once considering the weight of his actions. And now he was paying for it. He did deserve it, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. He grabbed Landon's drink and made his way back to the table, carefully setting it down. Landon smirked. That took long enough. Mason didn't rise to the bait. "Anything else, sir?" Landon chuckled, clearly disappointed that he wasn't getting a reaction. "Nah, I think I'm good." Mason nodded and walked away. He wasn't proud. He wasn't angry. He was just exhausted, the reality of power. By the time the shift ended, Mason was drained. Every muscle in his body ached, and his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had always assumed that power was permanent, that once you reached the top, you never had to worry about falling, but that wasn't true. Power could be taken away in an instant, and when that happened, the people you stepped on along the way, they'd be waiting. A different kind of lesson. He was still lost in thought when he heard a voice behind him. "You handled that better than I expected." Mason turned to find Avery standing nearby, arms crossed, studying him. "I'm full of surprises," he muttered. Avery raised a brow. "So, you didn't feel like throwing his drink in his face?" Mason smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I did. But I figured you'd fire me if I did." Avery gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're learning," Mason frowned. "Learning what exactly?" She studied him for a moment before speaking. "That power isn't about status," she said. "It's about how you treat people. And for the first time in your life, you're seeing what it feels like to be on the other side of the table." Mason stayed silent because she was right. Again. And that was the part that scared him the most. Avery took a step back. "Get some rest, Donovan. Tomorrow's another day." She walked away, leaving him standing there, lost in his thoughts. He had spent his entire life believing that money and power made him untouchable. But tonight he had learned that respect wasn't something you could buy. It had to be earned. And he wasn't sure if he had ever really earned it before. As he walked out into the cold night, he found himself wondering, was it too late to start? The weight of reality. Mason had never been a morning person, but waking up sore, exhausted, and mentally drained made dragging himself out of bed even worse. His body ached in ways he wasn't used to. Not from luxury workouts at exclusive gyms, but from actual labor. He lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, trying to process what his life had become. A few months ago, he had been at the top of the world. Now he was dragging himself out of bed to wait tables. The absurdity of it made him want to laugh and scream at the same time, but quitting wasn't an option. Not because he cared about the job, not even because he cared about Avery's twisted lesson, but because he refused to let her win. With a sharp breath, he pushed himself up, showered, dressed, and made his way back to La Belle Poke, ready for whatever fresh humiliation the day would bring. By the time he arrived, the morning staff was already setting up. The air smelled of fresh coffee and baked bread, the soft hum of conversation filling the space. He walked toward the back to grab his apron, but as he passed the bar, something made him stop. Avery sitting at a small corner table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pored over paperwork. For the first time, he noticed how hard she worked. Not just barking orders, not just making power plays, but actually running the place. He had assumed she was just enjoying the thrill of his downfall, but watching her now, shoulders tense, eyes scanning numbers and reports, he realized she was doing something he had never done. She was in the trenches, working alongside the people who made this place run. And that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The morning shift. The morning shift started off rough. Marina had zero patience for him today, shoving a list of tasks into his hands before he could even blink. Tables need setting, cutlery needs polishing, and for the love of God, Donovan, learn how to carry a tray properly before you drop another one. Mason bit back a response. He was getting better, slowly, but mistakes still happened. By midday, he had almost settled into a rhythm. Then, the espresso machine broke, and somehow it became his problem. "Hey, Donovan!" Leo barked from the kitchen. "Fix the damn thing!" Mason stared at him. "You want me to fix a coffee machine?" Leo smirked. "What? Too complicated for you?" Mason rolled his eyes, but crouched down in front of the machine, inspecting it. He wasn't completely useless when it came to technical issues. He had spent enough time micromanaging his staff to know how things worked. Fiddling with a few buttons, checking the pressure valve. Within minutes, steam hissed as the machine came back to life. Marina blinked. "Huh, guess you're good for something after all." "Careful," Mason muttered. "You almost complimented me." She smirked. "Don't get used to it." A new perspective. As the day wore on, Mason began noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Like how the kitchen staff worked in perfect synchronization, moving seamlessly through the chaos of orders. Like how waiters could read a table's energy in seconds, adjusting their approach based on the mood of the guests. Like how Marina had memorized every regular customer's name and preferences, making them feel like VIPs without them even realizing it. He had owned this business for years, but he had never seen it not like this. It was humbling, it was uncomfortable, and maybe, just maybe, it was a little fascinating. A conversation with Avery. Later that evening, Avery approached him while he was stacking plates. "You did well today," she said. Mason arched a brow. "Did you just give me a compliment?" "Don't get excited," she replied. "You're still terrible at this job, but at least now, you're paying attention." Mason leaned against the counter, studying her. "Why do you care if I learn anything?" Avery hesitated, then sighed. "The reality of change. Because this isn't just about you, Mason. It's about everyone." Avery's voice was calm but firm, each word landing with weight. "You built your empire on the backs of people you never respected. If you ever get the chance to own anything again," she met his gaze, unwavering, "I want you to remember what it feels like to be on this side of it." Mason frowned. "You think I'm ever getting another chance?" Avery tilted her head slightly. "That depends. Are you actually changing, or are you just playing along until you can figure out how to get back on top?" He didn't have an answer to that, and that was the most unsettling part, because for the first time he wasn't sure which was true. A different end to the night? After the last customer had left and the staff began closing up, Mason found himself behind the bar, wiping down counters. It was mindless work, the kind of thing he never would have done before. Now, it was almost peaceful. He didn't notice Avery watching him until she spoke. "You know, I didn't expect you to last this long." Mason snorted. "I didn't either." She leaned against the bar, studying him. "So, why are you still here?" Mason thought about that for a moment. Because of pride, maybe? Because he wanted to prove her wrong, definitely. But there was something else. Something he wasn't ready to admit yet. So instead, he just smirked. "Maybe I like the uniform," Avery rolled her eyes. "Go home, Donovan," he chuckled, tossing the towel onto the counter. Yeah, see you tomorrow, boss." As he stepped out into the cool night air, something strange settled in his chest. For the first time since losing everything, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he was actually learning, and that terrified him more than anything else. Understanding the rhythm. Mason was starting to recognize the patterns. The rhythm of the restaurant, the way the kitchen orchestrated every dish like a symphony, the subtle signals between the staff, the quick nods, the exchanged glances that communicated everything without words. He wasn't good at this job yet, not by a long shot, but he wasn't failing miserably anymore. And that, apparently, was a problem for some people. The sabotage begins. It started small, trays stacked just off balance, forcing him to scramble to catch them, orders mysteriously disappearing, making customers impatient. At first, he thought it was his own incompetence. Then, he noticed the smirks, the exchanged glances behind his back. Leo in particular seemed to be enjoying himself way too much. "You're looking tense, Donovan," Leo commented as Mason barely managed to steady a tray of wine glasses. "First week nerves still getting to you?" Mason exhaled slowly. "Just another day in paradise." Leo chuckled. "Careful, you almost sound like a real waiter." Mason shot him a glare, but didn't engage. That was what Leo wanted, a reaction. And Mason wasn't about to give him one. But the petty sabotage? That was starting to get old. The breaking point. By the middle of the shift, frustration had settled deep in Mason's chest. Every time he started to get comfortable, something went wrong. He set a plate down at a table, only for the customer to frown. "This isn't what I ordered," Mason blinked. What?" The woman pushed the plate toward him. "I asked for salmon, not steak." He swore he had taken the right order. His eyes flickered toward the kitchen, where Leo stood leaning against the counter, watching with a lazy smirk. Understanding clicked. Leo had switched the plates on purpose. The smug bastard wanted him to mess up. Mason's jaw clenched. The old verse, the unknown, the old him would have exploded, would have humiliated Leo in front of everyone. The new him? Well, he didn't know who that was yet, but he knew one thing. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice even. "I'll fix it right away." As he turned toward the kitchen, Avery caught his eye. She had seen everything. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to, but her gaze held a simple message. Don't let them break you. The shift in control. Mason waited. He played along for the rest of the night. He took every sabotage attempt in stride. The missing orders, the switched tickets, the plates mysteriously forgotten, but he was watching. And he learned, by the end of the shift, when the last table had been cleared and the staff began winding down, Mason finally made his move. He walked straight into the kitchen, calmly leaning against the counter where Leo was cleaning up. "You've had your fun," Mason said. Leo didn't even look up. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mason smirked. "Right, just like it wasn't you who swapped out my orders, or forgot to tell me about the table switch." Leo finally looked at him, eyes mocking. "Must be tough, huh, being on the other side of things?" Mason didn't flinch. "You want me to quit?" Leo tilted his head. "Wouldn't mind." Mason let out a short laugh. "Then you'd be disappointed." Leo's smirk faded, just slightly. "I get it," Mason continued. "You want payback. You want me to feel what it's like to be powerless, and trust me, I do." His voice lowered. "But here's the thing. I'm still here." Leo studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he walked away. Mason exhaled slowly. That wasn't a win. Not yet, but it was a step forward. Avery's approval. Avery approached as he was untying his apron. "You didn't take the bait," she said. Mason glanced at her. "You saw what he was doing?" She nodded. "I wanted to see how you'd handle it." He chuckled. "Dry? And?" She considered for a moment. "You didn't explode. That's progress." Mason rolled his eyes. "High praise." Avery smirked. "For you?" "Yeah." He shook his head, tossing his apron over a chair. "So what now?" Avery tilted her head. "Now, you keep going, you keep showing up. You keep proving that you can handle more than just the easy parts." Mason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You know, I'm starting to think you actually want me to succeed." Avery's expression was unreadable. "Maybe." Mason frowned. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow breath before finally saying, "Because if you do change, maybe this whole thing won't have been a waste of time." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so for once, he stayed silent. He grabbed his coat, heading for the door, but just as he stepped outside, he heard Avery call after him. "Hey, Donovan!" A new understanding. Mason turned. Avery's expression was softer than usual. "See you tomorrow." For a moment he hesitated, not because he was considering quitting, but because, for the first time, he realized he actually wanted to come back. He gave her a small smirk. "Yeah, see you tomorrow." And for the first time since all of this started, he meant it. A change in the routine. Mason never thought he'd say this, but the job was getting easier. Not easy. Easier. His feet still ached at the end of every shift. His patience was constantly tested by entitled customers, and Leo still took every opportunity to mess with him. But something had changed. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was learning. He had stopped thinking like an outsider, and he had started paying attention. Friday night, the ultimate test. It was Friday night, the busiest night of the week. The restaurant was packed, every table was full, the kitchen was moving at a breakneck pace, and the bar was slammed with drink orders. Mason moved between tables without hesitation, balancing trays, taking orders, even remembering customer preferences without having to check his notepad night after night. "You're not completely useless anymore," she commented as he passed by. Mason smirked. "I'm touched." "You should be," she said. "A month ago you were one spill away from being thrown out." Mason rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. Because she was right. Things were going smoothly, too smoothly, which meant something was bound to go wrong, and it did, an unwelcome surprise. A large group of high-profile guests had booked a last-minute reservation, and Avery had personally assigned the table to Mason. "Don't screw this up," she told him, handing him the list of orders. Mason scanned the names and felt his stomach drop. Among them was Nathan Beckett, one of his former business partners, and Beckett wasn't alone. Seated around the table were investors, people Mason used to negotiate deals with over expensive cigars and whiskey. Now, he was serving them food, face to face with the past. Beckett recognized him immediately. "Well, well," he said, leaning back in his chair with a slow smile. "Mason Donovan. I almost didn't believe it when I heard the rumors." Mason kept his expression neutral. "Good evening, Mr. Beckett. What can I get for you?" The entire table fell silent. They were waiting for him to react. "Waiting for him to crack?" Beckett chuckled. "I've got to say, I never expected to see you like this. Waiting tables. That's a hell of a fall from grace." Mason's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Your drinks will be right out," he said smoothly before walking away. Behind him, he heard the quiet murmurs, the chuckles, but he didn't let it get to him. Not this time. Owning the moment. At the bar, he grabbed Beckett's drink and paused. A choice to make. Mason had a choice. He could walk back to that table, seething, hating every second of it, or he could own it. He turned, walking back with the same confidence he once had when closing a business deal. As he set the glass down in front of Beckett, he met his eyes and smirked. "Careful with this one," he said. "It's expensive." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "Are you warning me, Donovan?" Mason's smirk didn't fade. "Just making sure you know I still have good taste." A few of the investors chuckled, the tension breaking just slightly. Beckett studied him for a long moment before nodding, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Enjoy your meal," Mason said, turning to leave, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the punchline of the joke, a new perspective. Later that night, after the shift had ended, Avery approached him. "You handled yourself well tonight," she said. Mason wiped his hands on a towel. "Didn't give you the meltdown you were expecting?" Avery smirked. "Maybe I was hoping for a little drama," Mason chuckled. "Sorry to disappoint." She tilted her head slightly. "You know, the old you would have thrown a drink in Beckett's face." Mason leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, the old me didn't have much to lose." Avery studied him for a moment before saying, "Maybe the new you has something to gain." Mason hesitated, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if this was just about proving her wrong anymore. Maybe he was actually changing. And that scared him more than losing everything ever did. The breaking point. Despite his small personal victory, Mason still wasn't completely accepted by the staff. That became painfully clear when he overheard a conversation between Marina and Leo in the break room. "He's lasted longer than I thought," Leo muttered. Marina scoffed. "Yeah, but does he actually care? Or is this just another game for him?" "Does it matter?" Leo asked. "He's still the same guy who treated us like dirt for years. I don't care if he suddenly knows how to carry a tray." Mason felt something twist in his chest, because for the first time, he realized it wasn't enough to just show up. He needed to prove he had changed. But how? A different conversation with Avery. That night, as he walked toward the door, he hesitated. Then, instead of leaving, he turned back. He found Avery sitting at a table, going over paperwork. She looked up, surprised. "Forget something?" Mason leaned against the chair across from her. "How do I get them to trust me?" Avery studied him carefully. "You really want to know?" He nodded. She exhaled. "You want people to believe you've changed, Mason? You have to stop pretending it's enough just to be here." Mason frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Avery set her pen down. "You're doing the job, yeah, but you're still acting like an outsider, like this is temporary. People don't trust you because they think the second you get a chance, you'll go right back to who you were." Mason hesitated. "And what if I won't?" Avery's expression softened slightly. "Then prove it." The shift in mindset. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Mason realized something more than just surviving. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to be seen differently. And that meant he had to do more than just show up. He had to earn respect. For real this time. A different kind of battle. Mason had spent his entire life proving people wrong. He built an empire because he refused to be underestimated. He thrived on competition, on proving he was better, smarter, untouchable. But now he wasn't trying to prove his power. He was trying to prove that he deserved to be here. And that was a different kind of battle entirely. A night of chaos. The restaurant was buzzing with energy that night. Every table was filled. The kitchen was running on overdrive, and the air smelled of seared meats, fresh herbs, and expensive wine. Mason had never been this focused before. Orders came in and he took them with efficiency, balancing trays, remembering preferences, staying ahead of the chaos. He was getting the hang of it. But it wasn't enough. Because no matter how well he performed, there was still doubt in the air. The staff watched him, like they were waiting for him to fail. And tonight, he was going to change that. Crisis in the kitchen. Halfway through the night, the tension in the kitchen spiked. The executive chef, Carla, a tough woman with zero patience, slammed her knife onto the cutting board. "We're running out of sea bass," she barked. Leo, plating a dish, smirked. "Guess someone forgot to check inventory." Carla glared. "Not funny, Morgan. We have 5 tables with sea bass orders and we don't have enough to cover them." Mason was passing through when he caught the panic in Marina's face. "Let me guess," he said, slowing his pace. "The supplier didn't deliver?" Carla huffed. "Something like that." Mason scanned the kitchen. This was bad. A mistake like this in a high-end restaurant, it could tank the entire night. And the worst part, one of the tables waiting on the sea bass was Beckett's table. Mason clenched his jaw. He knew how this worked. If Beckett didn't get what he ordered, he'd make sure everyone knew about it. No room for failure. This was a problem that couldn't be ignored. So, Mason made a decision. "I'll fix it," he said. Carla frowned. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Mason grabbed his jacket. "I'll be back in 15 minutes. And before anyone could stop him, he was out the door. A new approach. It was a gamble. The old Mason would have just yelled at someone for screwing up, but that wasn't an option anymore. He needed a solution, fast. Mason sprinted 2 blocks to Carter's Market, one of the best seafood suppliers in the area. The store was closing in 5 minutes, and Mason practically barreled through the doors, panting. The owner, a grumpy old man named Frank Carter, raised an eyebrow. "You look like hell, Donovan." Yeah, Mason gasped, hands on his knees. "You still got sea bass?" Frank snorted. "Maybe. Why should I sell it to you?" Mason straightened, his breathing still uneven. "Because if you don't, LaBelle Polk's reputation takes a hit, and if that happens, you lose one of your best restaurant clients." Frank studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked toward the back and emerged with a fresh stack of sea bass fillets. "That'll cost you," Frank said, smirking. Mason pulled out his wallet without hesitation. "I don't care," he muttered, handing over his card moments later. He was sprinting back to the restaurant with a bag full of the one thing that could save the night. A crisis averted. Mason burst into the kitchen, slightly out of breath. Carla's eyes widened when she saw the bag. "You actually got it?" Mason smirked. "Told you I'd fix it." Carla grabbed the fillets and immediately got to work, calling out new instructions to the line cooks. Leo watched from the side, his usual smirk gone. "You ran to Carter's Market for this?" Mason shrugged. "Seemed faster than waiting for a miracle." Leo folded his arms, studying him. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't mockery either, and that meant something. A shift in the air. The sea bass orders went out without a hitch. Beckett and his table never even knew there had been a problem. The crisis was avoided. And for the first time since he started working here, Mason felt something different in the air. It wasn't just silence. It wasn't just reluctant tolerance. It was respect. Marina passed him as he wiped down a counter. "Nice save," she muttered. Carla gave him a simple nod. "Not bad, Donovan." Even Leo, the one person who never gave him an inch, simply said, "Not the worst thing you've done." For Leo, that was practically a standing ovation. Mason exhaled. He had done it. For the first time. They didn't see him as the arrogant billionaire who lost everything. They saw him as one of them. And that mattered. A moment with Avery. Avery found him in the back alley after closing, leaning against the brick wall, taking in the cold night air. "You didn't have to do that," she said, stepping beside him. Mason didn't look at her. "Yeah, I did." She studied him for a long moment. "You're different," Mason chuckled. "Don't get all sentimental on me now." Avery smirked. "Not a chance." They stood in silence for a while, the distant hum of the city filling the space between them. Then, Avery said something that caught him off guard. "You're earning their trust." Mason finally looked at her. A shift in perception. She wasn't mocking him. She wasn't testing him. She meant it. For the first time, Avery Westwood saw him as something other than the man who ruined her father's life. And for the first time, Mason wasn't sure if that scared him, or made him feel something else entirely, something he wasn't ready to name yet, the illusion of control. Mason had spent years mastering control. Control over negotiations, control over his employees, control over his own damn image. But lately, he was starting to realize how little control he actually had, because no matter how much progress he made at La Belle Poic, no matter how many small victories he stacked up, there were some people who would never forget who he used to be. And tonight, he was about to face one of them. A night like any other, until it wasn't. The night started normally enough. Mason had begun settling into his role, and for the first time, the tension in the restaurant didn't feel so suffocating. Sure, there were still the occasional glares, the whispers from staff who hadn't quite let go of their resentment, but there was also something new in the air, something that almost felt like acceptance. He wasn't one of them yet, but he was closer than he'd ever been before. And then he walked in, the ghost of his past. Mason was at the bar drying glasses when he heard the voice, a voice that made his entire body tense. "You've got to be kidding me." He turned slowly, already knowing who he'd see: Grayson Pierce, an old rival, a man Mason had humiliated more times than he could count. Grayson leaned against the bar, his sharp-tailored suit a clear sign that he was still thriving in the world Mason had been exiled from, and judging by the smirk on his face, he was enjoying this moment far too much. "Mason Donovan," Grayson said, shaking his head. "Wiping glasses at a restaurant you used to own. Now that's a sight I never thought I'd see." Mason kept his face blank. "What can I get you?" Grayson let out a low chuckle, as if this was all some grand joke. "That depends," he said, eyes gleaming. "Can you handle a drink order, or is that too complicated for you these days?" Mason ignored the bait. "Whiskey? Neat," he guessed. "You always ordered that before." Grayson's smirk faltered, just slightly, as if annoyed that Mason wasn't reacting the way he wanted. "Make it a double," Grayson said, sitting down. "I'm in the mood to celebrate. A test of patience." Mason poured the drink calmly, setting it down in front of him. "Celebrating what?" he asked Grayson. Swirled the glass. "The fact that some people know how to hold on to power, while others," he gestured at Mason's uniform, "well, you get the picture." Mason's grip on the bar tightened. Because that right there was the old version of himself staring back at him. The arrogance, the condescension, the belief that power was permanent. The old Mason would have ripped Grayson apart in seconds. But Mason wasn't that man anymore. So, instead, he simply said, "Enjoy your drink," and walked away. The waiting game. He could feel Grayson watching him all night, gouting for him to snap, gating for him to break. And Mason refused to give him that satisfaction. But the moment of truth came when Grayson pushed things too far. Grayson's game. It was late in the evening when Grayson suddenly raised his voice, his gaze locked directly on Avery, who had just passed by. "You must be Avery Westwood," Grayson said, smirking. "I've heard all about you." Avery stopped, turning to face him. "And you are?" Grayson grinned, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Someone who appreciates a good revenge story. And I have to say, yours is fantastic." Mason's stomach dropped. Grayson was enjoying this, enjoying watching him stand there, powerless while he stirred the pot. "I mean," Grayson continued, "taking over Donovan's empire, making him work for you, that's the kind of poetic justice you don't see every day." Avery's expression didn't change. "I don't remember asking for your opinion." Grayson let out a mocking laugh. "Come on, don't be shy. You got exactly what you wanted, didn't you?" He leaned forward. "Tell me though, what's your end game? Keeping him here forever? Making sure he never gets back on his feet?" Doubt. Mason's blood boiled, not because of what Grayson was saying, but because he saw something flicker in Avery's eyes. Doubt. She wasn't sure. And for the first time, Mason realized maybe she never had an endgame. Maybe she had never expected him to last this long. Maybe she had never considered what came next. The final blow. Grayson smirked. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid." Avery's jaw tightened. "I think you're afraid that if you let him go, he'll come back stronger than before, and you won't have control anymore." Silence. And then, "That's enough." The words came from Mason. Grayson turned, amused. "Oh, did I touch a nerve?" Mason stepped forward, a challenge met head-on. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Mason shook his head, exhaling. You don't actually care about what happened to me. You're just here to make yourself feel better. Grayson smirked. And what if I am? Mason tilted his head slightly. Then I guess that means you're not as secure as you like to pretend. Grayson's expression darkened. Just slightly, but Mason wasn't finished. You can stand here all night trying to rub it in. You can remind me of everything I lost. But the difference between us? He smiled. I'm learning from my mistakes. Grayson scoffed. Right. You really believe that? Mason didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said. I do. For the first time, Grayson had nothing to say. He drained the rest of his whiskey, set the glass down, and stood. Well, he said, this was fun. His gaze flickered to Avery one last time. Think about what I said, he told her, because sooner or later, you're going to have to decide what you really want. And then, he laughed. A lingering question. The silence between Mason and Avery stretched. He turned to her. You okay? She nodded. But something in her expression was off. Grayson's words had gotten to her. Mason's voice was careful. Avery, was he right? She looked at him. Are you afraid to let me go? She hesitated. And for the first time, she didn't have an answer. Mason had never seen Avery look uncertain before. She was always composed, always in control. But now, after Grayson's words had settled between them, there was something different in her eyes, and he hated that it was him asking the question. Are you afraid to let me go? Avery's silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then finally, I don't know, she admitted. It wasn't the answer he had expected, and it wasn't one he was ready to deal with. A restless morning. The next morning, Mason showed up early at La Belle Polk not because he had to, but because he needed to think. Avery's words had been playing on a loop in his mind since last night, and no matter how much he tried to ignore them, they wouldn't leave him alone. She didn't know if she wanted him to stay. She didn't know if she was ready to let him leave. And worst of all, neither did he. A conversation with Marina. He was polishing glasses behind the bar when Marina walked in, raising an eyebrow. You're here early, she observed. Mason shrugged. Couldn't sleep. Marina studied him for a moment. Something happened? Mason debated answering, then, against his better judgment, he said, Grayson Pierce showed up last night. Marina made a face. Ugh, that guy's an ass. Yeah, well, he got into Avery's head. Marina tilted her head. How so? Mason exhaled. He made her question whether she actually wants me to leave when this is over. Marina leaned against the bar, arms crossed. Question he didn't want to answer, and that bothers you because... Mason frowned, because it's a ridiculous question. Marina smirked. Is it? Mason shot her a look. What the hell does that mean? Marina didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him, with that same knowing expression she always had when she was about to say something that would piss him off. Look, Donovan, she said, you've changed, whether you want to admit it or not. You're not the same guy who walked in here thinking this job was beneath him. Mason opened his mouth to argue, but Marina cut him off. And maybe, she continued, Avery's starting to see that too. That shut him up, because the truth was, he had been so focused on proving himself that he hadn't stopped to consider what happened next. What happens after this? What happened when this was over? Would he walk away and go back to the life he had before? Or had he already crossed a line he couldn't come back from? The dinner shift. The dinner shift started off smooth. Mason was focused, running the floor like he had been doing this his whole life. At some point he caught. Avery was watching him. She wasn't testing him. She wasn't waiting for him to fail. She was just watching. And for the first time, it made him feel unsteady, because what if Marina was right? What if Avery wasn't just questioning whether she wanted him to stay? What if he was too? The breaking point. It came later that night. It started with a customer complaint. A man at table 9 had barely touched his meal. When Mason checked in, the guy crossed his arms and gave him a cold glare. This steak is overcooked, the man said. Mason frowned. I can get you a new one, sir. The man scoffed. I shouldn't have to wait twice for a dish that should have been right the first time. Mason kept his voice level. I understand and I apologize. I'll take care of it right away. But the man wasn't finished. He looked Mason up and down, smirking. You know, he said, I thought you looked familiar. You used to be someone, didn't you? a familiar humiliation. Mason froze. And just like that, every eye in the restaurant was on him. "I remember now," the man continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "Mason Donovan. The guy who had it all until he lost it." A few whispers rippled through the room, and Mason felt it, that familiar burn of humiliation. For a moment, he flashed back to that night when Avery had taken everything, to the way the world had laughed, to the way people had enjoyed watching him fall. He could feel old instincts kicking in, the need to snap back, to humiliate this guy just as badly. But then, something else happened. He looked across the room and saw Avery watching him. And suddenly, everything clicked. This was the moment where he had to decide who he really was now, the choice. So instead of giving in to the anger, he took a slow breath. "Would you like me to replace your steak, sir?" he asked, his voice calm. The man smirked. "No," he said, "I'd rather watch you squirm." Mason didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. "Then, I hope you enjoy the show." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the man stunned. A different kind of victory. Back in the kitchen, Leo was watching. "You didn't lose it," Leo said, arms crossed. Mason grabbed a towel, wiping his hands. "Nope." Leo studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "Guess I owe Marina $20. Mason raised an eyebrow. "You bet on me losing it?" Leo smirked. "Hell yeah." Mason laughed, shaking his head. And for the first time, he realized something. This place wasn't just a punishment anymore. It had become something else entirely. And he had no idea what that meant. A conversation with Avery. At the end of the night, as he was pulling off his apron, Avery walked over. "You handled that well," she said. Mason shrugged. "Would have been easier to just punch the guy." Avery smirked. "But you didn't." "Nope," she hesitated, then said, "Marina thinks you're different now." Mason looked at her. "And what do you think?" Avery didn't answer right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. I don't know what to do with you anymore." Mason's chest tightened, because neither did he, and that was the scariest part of all. Change isn't instant. Mason had always believed that clarity came in a single defining moment, like a light switch flicking on, suddenly illuminating everything at once. But he was starting to realize change didn't work that way. It wasn't an explosion, it was a slow burn, piling up one by one, until suddenly, you weren't the same person anymore. And the scariest part, he wasn't sure when it had happened. All he knew was, when Avery looked at him now, she didn't just see the man who had ruined her father. And when he looked at her, he didn't just see the woman who had taken everything from him. And that was a problem, because the lines they had drawn between them, they were starting to blur. A night like any other, until it wasn't. The night started off like any other. The restaurant was packed, the staff was buzzing with energy, and Mason was in control of the floor, not just surviving, thriving. He didn't need to check the menu anymore. He could recite the specials from memory. He knew which customers were impatient, which ones preferred personal attention, which ones just wanted to be left alone. Somewhere along the way, the job had become second nature, and people were noticing. Even Leo had stopped taking shots at him. Marina barely gave him hell anymore. It wasn't just about doing the job well. It was the fact that he wasn't faking it anymore, and that was the most unexpected thing of all. Under Avery's watchful eye, Avery watched him from the bar, sipping her drink, eyes narrowed in quiet observation. She didn't say anything, didn't interrupt, she just watched. And Mason knew exactly why. Avery was trying to figure out what this meant. For him, for her, for the entire damn situation they had created. Because no matter how much they ignored it, there was a simple, undeniable truth staring them both in the face. This wasn't punishment anymore. This was something else entirely, and neither of them knew what the hell to do about it. The turning point. It happened near the end of the shift. It started with a simple mistake. A waiter, one of the newer guys, nervous and fidgety, misread an order and sent a shellfish dish to the wrong table. Normally, it wouldn't have been a big deal, except this time, the customer was allergic. Instinct took over. Mason was across the room when he heard it. The sharp intake of breath, the clatter of silverware against porcelain. The man at table 7 was turning red, struggling to breathe. Mason didn't think, didn't hesitate. He moved fast, rushing to the man's side, catching his shoulders before he collapsed against the table. "Does he have an EpiPen?" Mason barked to the woman sitting next to him. She was panicked, shaking. I don't know." Mason scanned the restaurant. Then Avery's voice rang out. "Back room, top shelf, first aid kit." Mason was already moving. He sprinted past the kitchen, throwing open the supply cabinet, grabbing the pen without thinking. By the time he got back, the man was wheezing, his body starting to shake. Mason knelt beside him, steady hands, fast movements, uncapping the pen, pressing it into his thigh. The man jerked. Then, slowly, his breathing started to even out. A minute passed, then another, and finally, he was okay. A silent restaurant. The entire restaurant had fallen silent. Every single person had stopped what they were doing, watching. Then the customer's wife let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Mason just nodded, standing back up, but when he turned, he caught Avery staring at him, like she was seeing him for the first time. Like something had just clicked into place. And in that moment, Mason knew, whatever this was between them, it had just changed, a different kind of reputation. The restaurant buzzed after closing. The story of what had happened spread fast, and by the time the last table was cleared, it had turned into legend. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one of the waiters whispered. "Marina, you owe me $50, Leo muttered. Marina groaned. "Damn it, I really thought he'd freeze up." Mason rolled his eyes, but he couldn't ignore the shift in the air. This wasn't just respect anymore. It was something deeper. It was trust, and for the first time, he realized he actually cared about that. A conversation that changed everything. Later that night, as he was pulling off his apron, Avery walked over. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, watching him. "You didn't hesitate," she finally said. Mason frowned. "You sound surprised." "I am." He studied her. "Why?" Avery exhaled. "Because the Mason Donovan I knew wouldn't have lifted a finger unless there was something in it for him." Mason tilted his head. "Maybe you didn't know me as well as you thought." She let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe." The words that hit hard. Silence stretched between them. Then, Avery said something that stopped him cold. "You don't belong here anymore." Mason's stomach tightened. "What?" Avery met his gaze. "You don't belong in this restaurant. Not as a waiter, not anymore." For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Because, for months, this place had been the only thing keeping him from falling apart. And now, Avery, the woman who had put him here in the first place, was telling him it was time to leave. The unanswered question. "You said I had to prove myself," he said carefully. Avery nodded. "And you did." Mason clenched his jaw. "So what happens now?" Avery hesitated, and then, "I don't know." The honesty in her voice hit him like a brick. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Neither of them had expected this. Neither of them had planned for what came next. And now, standing here in the quiet aftermath of something they didn't even have words for, they were both facing a future they couldn't ignore. A future they couldn't ignore. They were both realizing it now. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was something else entirely, and neither of them knew how to stop it. For the first time since all of this had started, Mason felt lost. Not because he had failed, not because he had something to prove, but because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what came next. A fear he didn't expect. He had spent months thinking this was just temporary, that he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right opportunity to take his life back. But now, the idea of walking away felt like tearing himself from something he wasn't ready to lose. And that scared him more than anything else ever had. A sleepless night, Mason barely slept that night. He tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. Avery's words kept playing on a loop in his head. "You don't belong in this restaurant. Not as a waiter. Not anymore." That was supposed to be a victory, wasn't it? She'd been waiting for him to fail. Instead, he had earned his place. And now, instead of kicking him out, she was telling him he was too good to stay. So why didn't it feel like a win? Why did it feel like the ground beneath him had been ripped away? Why did it feel like he wasn't ready to leave? A decision made. By the time morning came, Mason had made a decision. He wasn't going to spend the day sitting in his apartment overthinking. He wasn't going to let himself spiral. So instead, he did the only thing that made sense. He went to work. An unexpected comfort. La Belle Pouac wasn't even open yet when Mason stepped inside. The morning prep team was just arriving, the scent of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. The restaurant was quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chaos of the dinner rush. It felt strangely calming, like a place he actually belonged. He hadn't expected that, and yet, here he was, a conversation with Avery. He found Avery in her office, already buried in paperwork. She looked up when he knocked on the doorframe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You're here early," Avery said. Mason shrugged, stepping inside. "So are you," she smirked. "But it was tired. I own the place. What's your excuse?" He sat down across from her. "What happens now?" Avery leaned back in her chair, studying him. "That depends," she said. "On what?" Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "On you." A shift in control. Mason froze. Because for months, this had been her game. Her rules, her punishment. But now she was putting the next move in his hands. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The night that changed everything. The dinner shift that night was busier than usual. Reservations were stacked, the kitchen was overwhelmed, and the staff was pushing to keep up. It should have been stressful, but for some reason, Mason felt calm, because for the first time, he wasn't questioning why he was here. A change he didn't expect. He wasn't counting down the days until he could walk away. He was just doing the job, and maybe he actually liked it. The night passed in a blur. At some point, Mason caught Avery watching him. She wasn't testing him anymore. She wasn't waiting for him to fail. She was just watching. And that realization hit him harder than he expected. Because if Avery had finally stopped seeing him as the man who destroyed her father, then who the hell was he now? An unexpected conversation. At the end of the night, when the last table had been cleared and the staff had begun cleaning up, Mason found himself gravitating toward Avery's office again. She wasn't there. Instead, he found her standing at the bar, nursing a drink, lost in thought. For a moment, he just watched her. The way she rested her elbows against the counter, the way her fingers toyed with the rim of the glass, she looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. And before he could stop himself, he said, "Are you okay?" Avery blinked, as if pulled from her thoughts. Then, after a beat, "I don't know," she admitted. Mason hesitated. Then, carefully, he sat down beside her. "That makes two of us." Avery huffed a quiet laugh. "That's a first," Mason smirked. "Don't get used to it." The decision. Silence stretched between them. Then, "I want to stay." Avery's head snapped toward him. "What?" Mason exhaled. "I don't want to leave. Not yet." Avery stared at him, completely thrown off guard. "You're serious?" Mason nodded. "I know what you said," he continued. "I know you think I don't belong here anymore. But the thing is..." He hesitated. Then finally, he admitted, "I don't know where else I do belong." A shift neither of them understood. Avery's expression softened, and for the first time, Mason saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not victory, not satisfaction, something else. Something she wasn't ready to name. And maybe neither was he. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't just about proving himself. This was something else entirely. Something neither of them knew how to walk away from. And for the first time since all of this started, Mason wasn't sure if he wanted to. Redefining power. Mason had spent his entire life chasing power, control, dominance. He built an empire from nothing, convinced that money made the man, that respect could be bought, that fear was the best way to stay on top. But standing here in the quiet, dimly lit bar of La Belle Epoque, watching Avery Westwood process the fact that he wanted to stay, for the first time, he realized how wrong he had been all along. Because this wasn't about power anymore. This was about belonging. And he had never belonged anywhere quite like this. The question that changed everything. Avery didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at him, as if trying to figure him out. Mason didn't blame her. He was still figuring himself out too. Finally, she exhaled, setting her drink down with a soft clink against the glass counter. "You really want to stay?" she asked, her voice quiet. Mason nodded. "Yeah." Avery studied him. "Why?" Mason hesitated. He could have given her a dozen logical reasons. That he liked the work, that he wasn't done proving himself, that he didn't have anything else waiting for him out there. But none of those were the real reason. So instead, he met her gaze and said, "Because I don't want to go back to who I was." Avery's lips parted slightly, surprised. And that's when Mason knew. He had finally said something she wasn't expecting. The shift in the air. The next few days were different. People started treating him differently. Not just like a waiter, not just like the former billionaire forced into a new life. Like someone who actually belonged here. Leo didn't throw sarcastic comments his way anymore. Marilena actually let him drink coffee from the break room machine, instead of telling him it was reserved for real employees, and Avery started looking at him like she wasn't sure what the hell to do with him anymore. Which, considering their history, made perfect sense, because when this started, he had been the enemy. Now he wasn't so sure what they were to each other, and neither was she. Not everyone approved, but not everyone was happy about his decision. Word spread fast that Mason Donovan wasn't leaving. Some people supported it, others, like Landon, had a serious problem with it. Landon's interruption. Landon showed up on a Thursday night, his usual smug expression in place as he slid into a seat at the bar. Well, he said, smirking. "Still playing dress-up, I see." Mason grabbed a glass, pouring him his usual drink without a word. Landon raised an eyebrow. "No snappy comeback? No threats to throw me out?" Mason slid the glass in front of him. "Not worth my energy," Landon chuckled, shaking his head. "Wow, look at you. The mighty Mason Donovan. Humbled at last." Mason didn't react, but she walked up behind Mason. Arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're in my restaurant," she told Landon. "So, if you're here to amuse yourself at Mason's expense, you can leave." Landon smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Relax, Westwood. I'm just here to see how far the mighty have fallen." Avery's jaw tightened. "He hasn't fallen," she said. "He's just changed." The first real acknowledgement. Mason turned slightly, eyes flickering to Avery, because that was the first time she had ever acknowledged it, and it meant something. Something big, Landon scoffed, setting his glass down. "People like him don't change." Mason finally looked at him, and instead of anger, instead of the urge to prove something, he just felt pity, because Landon still believed that power was the only thing that mattered. And Mason? Mason had learned that real power came from something else entirely. He let out a breath and said simply, "Then maybe you never really knew me at all." Landon frowned, clearly thrown off, and Avery smiled, just a little, and that was worth more than every cent he had ever made in his past life. A different kind of conversation. That night, after the restaurant had closed, Mason and Avery sat outside in the cool air, either of them speaking for a while. "Then, you defended me today," Mason said. Avery sighed, rubbing her temple. "Don't get used to it." Mason smirked. Too late. She glanced at him, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "You like it," he shot back. Avery didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and then after a beat, "You don't owe me anything, you know." Mason frowned. "What?" Avery exhaled. "This. Staying here. Working here. You don't have to do it just because of what happened between us." Mason didn't hesitate. "I'm not." Avery's breath hitched. Then why are you still here?" she asked. Her voice, almost uncertain. Mason leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. Because I want to be. Nothing left but the truth. Silence stretched between them, and for the first time, there was nothing left between them but the truth. Not revenge, not resentment, just two people who had walked through hell and come out the other side completely different than when they started. And neither of them knew what came next. But maybe that was okay. For the first time in his life, Mason Donovan didn't need all the answers, because he had found something more valuable than power. Something real. He had found something real, and for the first time, that was enough. 1 month later, a customer at La Belle Poke waved Mason over, glancing at his name tag with a confused expression. "You look familiar," the man said, narrowing his eyes. "Didn't you used to be somebody?" Mason smirked, setting down the man's drink. "Nah," he said. "I think I finally am." Exactly where they were meant to be. From across the room, Avery watched him, shaking her head and smiling, because somehow, against all odds, they had both ended up exactly where they were supposed to be, together. Did you enjoy this story? If so, drop a like and leave a kind comment to encourage us. Your support means the world. And don't forget, we love you.